Hello, my name is Eric Hahn, and welcome to Shit, I Have to Teach in 20 Minutes, a podcast for history teachers, and it seems increasingly to anyone else who wants a quick dose of history. Thanks for joining us today. In every episode, my colleague Rob Good and I interview a historian about their scholarship. We ask them to identify the most important concepts they think teachers should share with their students about the topic for the day. We also include free lesson plans that can be downloaded from the episode notes linked to this podcast. So, Rob, what is our focus for today?
Well, today we're going to be talking about Thomas Jefferson's presidential administration. There's a lot with Jefferson. We're just focusing on the presidential administration. Jefferson is one of the most complicated and interesting figures in American history, and his presidency, which spanned from 1801 to 1809, provides an opportunity for students to explore what happens when one of our nation's most important idealists is confronted with the practical realities of governing a fledgling nation in the midst of both international and domestic conflict.
Well, as frequent listeners know, we are recording from St. Louis, Missouri, in the United States of America. And by the way, that listener from Fiji, we want to hear from you. We are excited that you are listening, but why are you listening on Fiji? We want to know. At any rate, St. Louis is the so-called gateway to the West, thanks at least in part to Jefferson and his purchase of the Louisiana Territory. I'm going to be all ears. So who is our historian for the day?
Today, we have the distinct pleasure of learning from Dr. Peter Kastor. Dr. Kastor is the Samuel K. Eddy Endowed Professor of History and American Culture Studies at Washington University. He studies the history of politics, policymaking, and culture in the United States, and he focuses much of his work on the half-century following American independence. He is also a scholar of the American presidency from its origins in the 18th century through its current manifestation in the present day. He has written and edited several books and many articles and book chapters about this time period, and he has also recently launched Creating a Federal Government, 1789 to 1829. This digital project provides the first comprehensive understanding of the federal workforce in its formative years, and I think it's going to be a great resource for teachers who are designing inquiry lessons, and we'll have a link to that in the episode notes. Peter also has a long history of supporting K-12 history teachers through Teaching American History grant projects and lots of other initiatives. So,
Wow. Thanks. Peter, Professor Kastor, what would you say are the most important ideas about the Jefferson administration that teachers should teach and students should know regarding that time period? And good luck with that question in 15 minutes.
It can be done, but like certain Olympic events, it has a high degree of difficulty, or at least it appears to, because Jefferson is so complicated and there's so much about him that we know. But I actually think you can reduce the Jefferson administration to the three general areas that you would for any presidential administration. What was its domestic policy? What was its foreign policy? And how did it operate within the nation's politics? How did it change the way politics operated? So I want to talk about the three of those. And people usually like to start by talking about political parties, so I'm actually going to talk about them last. Let's talk about what the administration actually did. So when Jefferson came into office in 1801, his principal domestic objective was to reduce the federal debt. The United States still owed a lot of money, like his predecessors. He wanted to reduce that. He wanted to do it in ways that were different from his immediate predecessor, John Adams, who is from a different political party, but his domestic policy is all driven not just by debt reduction, but debt retirement. He thought his goal, his North Star, was that he was going to eliminate the federal debt before he left office. Spoiler alert, he couldn't quite pull it off for reasons that are actually directly related to his foreign policy. So Jefferson had two goals that were in some ways at odds. There was a war in Europe that had erupted in the wake of the French Revolution. It started in 1792. There was a brief period of peace from 1801 to 1803, but then it started up again, and it lasted until 1815. And so Jefferson, like his predecessors, wanted to keep the U.S. out of that war. But he also wanted the U.S. to be able to have a vigorous trade around the world, because the principal source of federal revenue was on import duties on foreign goods. So you can't reduce the debt unless you increase the amount of duties being paid on foreign goods. And to do that, he didn't want to raise taxes. He said, let's just get more trade. But it's very difficult to build that trade without getting sucked into the conflicts in Europe. So that's his foreign policy. That's his domestic policy. They're really interconnected. Meanwhile, his political objective in the United States was that he was really the first opposition party candidate to get elected president. This came after the Federalists, who had been the governing party in the 1790s, lost the election of 1800, which was a really bitterly contested presidential contest. So Jefferson comes into office with two other conflicting goals. He wanted to calm the waters. When he got elected, he said, we are all Federalists, we're all Republicans, and we're all Americans. So he knew that party disagreement was inevitable, but he didn't want it to rip the Union apart. So he wanted to calm the waters, but he also wanted to consolidate his victory. And he was in pretty good shape. The Republicans, it's not the Republican Party we have now. They were sometimes called the Democratic Republicans, sometimes called the Republicans, sometimes called the Jeffersonians. It's all the same party. When he got elected, they won a number of gubernatorial races. They had a majority in the House. They did not have a majority in the Senate. And Jefferson had won election by the slimmest of possible margins. It had actually been thrown into the House of Representatives. So he wanted to consolidate that party victory without, while still calming the waters. Tough task. So those were his goals. Let's take a look at whether he was actually able to pull this off. So before we get into that, I'll simply ask you, any questions, anything you think your teacher should know about his objectives?
Well, you know, as you were talking about the objectives, particularly like reducing the amount of debt, it seemed very practical. And in the lead up, I sort of talked about him being an idealist. In what ways did he see like reducing the size of the federal government, debt, doing some of those pieces as part of a reestablishment of the principles of 1776 that he thought sort of the Federalists had gotten away from? Or
Right.
is he more, do you see him as a more of a calculating, practically minded sort of guy?
I see him as someone who sought practical means to achieve idealistically driven goals. The foreign and domestic policies I mentioned were directly rooted in that. He believed that an active foreign policy of the kind he wanted, would preserve national independence. I mean, independence had big meaning in 1776. He thought the Federalists had wanted to bring the U.S. into a de facto alliance with Great Britain, which to him undermined independence. He also worried that debt would saddle future generations with another form of dependence, and he wanted them to be independent of that debt. He believed that when people were individually independent, they controlled their own destinies. So we all often want to see people as either realistic or idealistic. I often see them as seeking realistic goals to achieve, realistic means to achieve idealistic goals.
Boy, where were you 30 years ago when I started teaching? That would have been really helpful.
Can I bother you with a follow-up question, Peter?
Yeah, sure.
On that?
Go ahead.
So you mentioned the opposition, to Jefferson, and I know. So just a little backstory here. Rob and I taught across the hall from each other in a high school, and we sometimes would take on the role of Jefferson and Hamilton, right?
Yes.
Debating each other. And here's my question to you, and it's an opinion question, and I won't reveal to you who was whom, but in your opinion, who was the more important person for U.S. history, for our current status as the United States of America? And you can take a little while to think about that, but I think it folds in nicely to.
I've got an answer.
Okay, good. Okay, go for it.
It's Jefferson, and he simply wins by duration. That's not to take anything away from Hamilton, but right. Hamilton's really only in his prime from about 1787 to 1795. Jefferson's an enormously important figure from, frankly, the early 1770s not just until his retirement from the presidency, but then he remains an important political figure until late in his retirement. So he wins by longevity and stick-to-itiveness.
I could not agree with you more.
Well,
I'm just saying, Eric at playing Jefferson, at least, nobody made a musical out of you. So just
that's true. But Jefferson has been the subject. They did though. 1776. The musical event. He's one of several characters.
Yeah. He's in Hamilton.
He's in Hamilton.
David Diggs. I've got his signature on my playbill. So okay. I'm sorry. So we digress. So, yeah. But that's very helpful. Going back to what you said about seeing practical goals to reach idealistic ends, right. Because that's super helpful. So you were going to tell us, how well did he do?
Sure. So at the end of the day, the foreign policy ends up driving everything, because from 1801 to really 1803, Jefferson thinks that the situation in the U.S. is pretty stable, and he's going to try to reduce certain government expenditures. He's going to try to reduce the total number of federal employees. He's going to do all of this. And then there are a series of international circumstances that turn all of this on its head. And it's a reminder that often we tend to think of presidents as people who have control over their own situations, but often situations have control over them. And the question is, how effectively do they respond? The first of these is the crisis over trade on the Mississippi River, which precipitates the Louisiana Purchase, signed in 1803. And the Louisiana Purchase is imposed on the U.S. on French terms. In 1803, Jefferson hoped to acquire New Orleans and the Gulf Coast. That's it. Small area of land. And instead, the French say, nope, you will buy everything we've got in mainland North America. It's kind of like if you went to the car dealership planning to get a Honda Civic and you came home with a Winnebago. And in the fullness of time, we usually, as teachers, often describe the purchase as beneficial to the U.S. It certainly created extraordinary opportunities for white settlers. But in its time, in fact, from 1803 to 1809, it's the single most challenging domestic policy challenge facing the Jefferson administration. The U.S. acquires this land. It has no clear boundaries. They don't really know who lives there. It's governed by Native Americans and would remain that way until Jefferson left office. So he's got to establish U.S. governing authority in the places where the French and the Spanish had governed. He's got to try to establish relationships with native polities throughout this enormous area of land. It's partly why how he reimagines the Lewis and Clark expedition as an effort to figure out what the heck the U.S. had bought. And it's incredibly costly. The U.S. creates a series of territories. It's how it carves up the land. But all those officials are federal employees. They're paid by the federal government. So when Jefferson leaves office in 1809, the number of civil and military employees is actually greater than it was in 1801. So he comes into office, like many presidents, thinking my predecessors have this bloated government. I'm going to clean out the fat. But one of the things that actually my own research made clear to me, which I had suspected, is that actually the rosters of federal employees are larger in 1809. So foreign policy drives that. Now, the Louisiana Purchase, for all of its challenges, it gives Jefferson a solution, because the French sold the land for reasons of their own, which was really good because the U.S. had been unable to solve this crisis they were having over Spanish control of the mouth of the Mississippi River. The U.S. is far less successful with Great Britain. As the British attempt to be victorious in their war effort against France, they impose a blockade over much of continental Europe. That blockade requires a navy of unprecedented size, so they also start forcibly impressing American sailors onto British ships. In every case, they claim these aren't Americans. These are actually people who were born in England. They're deserters from the Royal Navy. They just made it onto American ships. We're going to bring them over to we're going to force them onto our ships. And so the Jefferson administration tries a whole host of tactics to try to change this situation. They try to pressure the British. They try to offer them certain things in exchange. Secretary of State James Madison devotes most of his administration to doing this. As Secretary of State, he's both in charge of foreign policy and in charge of all the U.S. territories. So all this stuff I've mentioned, it all winds up on his desk. And in 1806 and 1807, it looks like the U.S. is going to go to war with Great Britain. The final spark is when a British warship fires on an American warship to demand the removal of people who the British claim are British deserters. The British had stopped American merchantmen. They've never fired on a ship of war carrying the U.S. flag. Looks like the U.S. is going to go to war. In the end, the administration decides not to, but they decide instead the U.S. will impose an embargo on all of its foreign trade, on everyone, with the completely overestimated belief in the importance of American trade in the Atlantic world. They hope that by shutting down trade with France and France's allies, it'll get them to somehow apply pressure on Britain and to create commercial opportunities for the U.S. They believed that that Britain was also dependent on American trade for its own economy, and they think that's going to, pressure Britain into relenting. None of this works. But it does do a very good job of shutting down all those import duties. So rather than reducing the debt, the embargo ends up increasing the debt. So Jefferson, in the end, has to abandon certain practical objectives in the pursuit of these broader idealistic goals. He is the first two-term president to succeed somebody else. And he exemplifies what a lot of two-term presidents face, which is they get elected to a second term because they were successful and lucky in their first term. And then their luck runs out. And perhaps they overestimate their ability to solve problems. Jefferson, as a foreign policy maker, there are mixed results. On domestic policy, he doesn't accomplish these early goals of reducing the debt and reducing the number of federal employees. He does reduce the budget to some degree. He's successful at that. He succeeds in other areas. He had deep fears about disunion. The Union is actually pretty strong by 1809. He's fundamentally committed to preserving African-American enslavement in the states and territories where it exists. And especially in Western territories, he preserves that in spaces where the federal control is much more limited. He also manages to avoid any major conflicts with Native Americans while applying greater pressure on them to cede land that they own to the United States. So he's sort of going to continue this process of the dispossession of native land. But his greatest single success is actually political. As I said, he comes into office with his party successful. He leaves office with it really successful. The embargo is wildly unpopular. And although Federalists have some successes in the congressional elections of 1808, and there are some divisions among the Republicans, they are the dominant party. In 1809, Jefferson hands over the presidency to his chosen successor, James Madison. Madison comes into office with the Federalists having a majority in the House, the Senate, among state governors, and in state legislatures. And it consolidates a majority that the Republicans will hold from 1801 really until they come apart at the seams in the 1820s.
It's amazing that you were able to do that too. You would have done it in 15 minutes had we not so rudely interrupted you.
You did it.
I think I went a little over, but yes, I said it can be done.
It can be done. And what, and not being even bound, following the two term limitation that by honor to relatively successful at the end. Of course, Madison had to and had a few problems that he had to deal with.
Jefferson had the same problem, which was the war in Europe. And the U.S. did not have the power to resolve that. The Europeans had to resolve their own problems. But you did mention something that's very, very important. George Washington's decision to retire after 2 terms, he actually wanted to retire after 1. Jefferson is one of the people who convinced him to run again. He was not only exhausted, but he thought it was very important that the first president retire. John Adams loses his bid for re-election. Jefferson normalized the presidency, a lot of its practices. 1, that you can have a president who gets elected in a 2-party system, comes into office, and consolidates his own party's control over the federal government while also acknowledging a role for the opposition party. Hugely important, something that many Americans took for granted until very, very recently. The notion that a president would serve 2 terms and then retire. Washington had done it. Jefferson normalized it. Jefferson and Washington together really normalized how the cabinet operated. Jefferson also was the first president to come into office and create a new cabinet. A new president gets new cabinet members. When John Adams was elected, he kept most of Washington's cabinet. He was from the same political party. What he didn't know was that Alexander Hamilton was sending them orders. When he found out, he felt completely betrayed and didn't fire them, but he demanded the resignation of most of them. So it's a kind of chaotic cabinet. Jefferson really introduced the notion of a stable cabinet operating in the ways that it does now. Washington had done a lot of that. Washington was incredibly effective in establishing his agency heads, but Jefferson's was the first presidency that looks like what we think a presidency is.
And I think for teachers, that's a powerful way in taking those 3 pieces of his domestic and foreign policy, and then what he did with party politics can help them establish that in their classes. Thank you so much for giving your time today, and to the teachers and the other listeners who are listening to us. We deeply appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
I wish we had more time. Oh, this cursed, oh, grab me. So remember,
I hope I didn't go too much over.
No, you're fine.
You're fine. Last statement here. Thank you again, Peter. Remember, you can download your free lesson from the link provided in the episode notes. Please be sure to stay tuned after this brief song to hear a description of those lessons.
Oh no, the clock is ticking, 20 minutes, time is spinning, pulling facts from thin air, hope they think I came prepared.
That was great. Peter Kastor definitely accomplished the impossible by giving great insight to the Jefferson administration in such a short span of time. My lesson is based on what Peter said about the centrality of the Louisiana Purchase to Jefferson's presidency. It asks students to evaluate the extent to which the Louisiana Purchase helped or hindered Jefferson from achieving his presidential goals. There are several sources, both primary and secondary, that students can use to form their interpretation.
That's a useful one. I was struck by Peter's focus on the unpopularity of Jefferson's Embargo Act of 1807. Other than the common Federalist political cartoon of, the accursed O'Grabney that's in most U.S. history textbooks, teachers and students don't tend to explore the topic much more, but there are numerous opposition broadsides and commentary about how devastating the Embargo Act was to the general population. In addition to that snapping turtle, I'm including another couple of images and a catchy little poem from the Library of Congress that students can explore to understand the deep divisions over the embargo itself. Questions are included.
And it is a catchy little poem. Well, thank you for listening. And remember, you can download the free lessons from the link provided in the episode notes. And please be sure to follow us wherever you get your podcasts and on YouTube. Eric will tell you how.
You can reach us for any feedback, questions, or suggestions you might have about the conversations or lessons at historyin20@gmail.com. History in 20 is all spelled out. We'd love to hear from you.
Especially the guy in Fiji or the woman in Fiji or the person in Fiji. We got to know. We got to hear from you.
Come on, Fiji. Thank you for joining us today.